Imagine waking up tomorrow morning without an alarm. No phone buzzing beside your bed, no smartwatch vibrating on your wrist, no clock glowing on the wall, and no sunlight sneaking through your window. It almost sounds impossible because most of us have become so dependent on alarms that oversleeping feels inevitable without one. But now imagine a world where alarm clocks had never been invented. No digital screens, no calendars, no work schedules, no school bells, no electricity, nothing that could tell people when to wake up. This wasn't just a few centuries ago. For almost the entire history of our species, humans lived exactly this way. And somehow, they still managed to wake up at the right time every single day. Hunters left before the first light reached the horizon. Gatherers began searching for food while the morning air was still cool. Entire communities coordinated their lives with remarkable precision, despite owning nothing that even resembled a clock. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. Most people would simply say they woke up when the sun came out. It's a simple answer, it's an intuitive answer, and it's also an answer that turns out to be surprisingly incomplete. Because the deeper scientists looked into human biology, traditional hunter-gatherer societies, and the evolution of sleep itself, the stranger the story became. Ancient humans weren't merely reacting to the sunrise. In many cases, they were already awake before the first rays of light touched the landscape. Even more surprising, modern humans may actually be worse at sleeping than our distant ancestors ever were. The little device sitting beside your bed tonight, the one you trust to wake you tomorrow morning, may actually be solving a problem that human civilization created itself. That sounds backwards because we usually think of technology as making life easier, not compensating for abilities we once naturally possessed. Yet the evidence increasingly suggests that for hundreds of thousands of years, the human body was perfectly capable of keeping time without batteries, without gears, and without a single mechanical invention. Somewhere between the age of stone tools and the age of smartphones, something changed. The question is not simply when alarm clocks were invented. The real question is why we ever needed them in the first place. To answer that, we have to go back to a time before cities, before farming, before written history, and even before civilization itself. Because hidden inside every human alive today is an ancient biological system that has been quietly keeping time for millions of years. Most people have heard of it, but very few understand just how astonishingly powerful it really is. And once you understand how that invisible clock guided the lives of our ancestors, you'll begin to see why the modern world may have disconnected us from one of the oldest survival systems evolution ever created. Long before humans built the first village, planted the first crop, or even imagined the idea of measuring time, evolution had already solved one of the greatest survival problems our ancestors would ever face. Hidden deep inside the human brain is a tiny cluster of nerve cells no larger than a grain of rice, known today as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Despite its intimidating scientific name, its job is astonishingly simple. It acts as the body's master clock, quietly coordinating thousands of biological processes every single day. It tells your body when to release hormones, when your body temperature should rise or fall, when you should feel alert, when you should feel hungry, and perhaps most importantly, when you should feel sleepy and when you should naturally wake up. This system didn't appear overnight. It was shaped over millions of years, long before our own species even existed. Every sunrise and every sunset became information. Every change in daylight slightly adjusted this internal clock until it matched the rhythm of the Earth itself. Unlike a mechanical clock that counts seconds, this biological clock constantly listens to the environment. The moment the first light enters your eyes, even before you're fully awake, specialized cells inside the retina send signals directly to this ancient timing system. In response, your brain begins shutting down the production of melatonin, the hormone responsible for making you feel sleepy, while increasing cortisol and other chemicals that prepare your body to become active. None of this requires conscious thought. You don't decide to stop producing melatonin any more than you decide to make your heart beat. Your body simply knows what time it is because, for hundreds of thousands of years, daylight was one of the most reliable signals nature ever provided. This explains something fascinating about ancient humans. They didn't need to calculate time because their bodies were constantly calculating it for them. Every morning, every evening, Every changing season quietly reset this invisible clock without them ever realizing it. But here's where the story becomes much more interesting. If every human carries this incredibly sophisticated biological clock inside their brain, and if it evolved to wake us with remarkable accuracy, then why do millions of people today sleep through multiple alarms, struggle to wake up in the morning, or feel exhausted even after 8 hours of sleep? Somewhere between the ancient world and the modern one, something interfered with a system that had worked almost perfectly for countless generations. And the first clue doesn't begin with technology. It begins with something as ordinary as the night itself. Modern life has quietly convinced us that sleep happens in isolation. We close the bedroom door, switch off the lights, silence our phones, and expect 8 uninterrupted hours of rest inside a safe and controlled environment. For ancient humans, however, sleep was nothing like that. Night was not a peaceful pause between 2 days. It was one of the most dangerous parts of life. Long before the invention of cities and secure homes, people slept in open landscapes surrounded by forests, rivers, insects, changing weather, and predators that became active only after sunset. In such a world, sleeping too deeply or too carelessly could become a fatal mistake. Evolution responded to this danger in a remarkable way. Instead of allowing humans to completely disconnect from their surroundings, it shaped our sleep to remain surprisingly sensitive to changes in the environment. Even today, scientists have found that the human brain continues monitoring sounds while we sleep. A completely unfamiliar noise is far more likely to wake you than a familiar one, even if both are equally loud. It is an ancient survival mechanism that has never disappeared. Our ancestors depended on it every single night. The crack of a branch, the distant howl of an animal, the sudden silence of insects, or unusual movement near the campfire could instantly shift the brain from deep sleep toward alertness before a person even became fully conscious. In other words, ancient humans didn't simply sleep through the night, they listened to it. But nature wasn't only a source of danger. It was also an incredibly reliable source of information. Hours before the sun became visible, the world itself began announcing that morning was approaching. Temperatures slowly dropped before dawn. Changing air currents carried different scents across the landscape. Insects gradually became quieter, while the first birds began singing long before sunrise painted the horizon. These daily patterns repeated so consistently that they became biological signals as dependable as any clock ever built by humans. Generation after generation grew up surrounded by these rhythms until the human brain learned to anticipate them automatically. Waking up wasn't triggered by a sudden alarm blasting beside the head. It was the final step in a long chain of environmental cues that had already been preparing the body for activity well before the eyes opened. To us, the forest may seem silent in the early morning, but to ancient humans it was full of messages. Every sound, every shift in temperature, every change in light carried information about what was about to happen next. Their survival depended on noticing those details, while ours rarely does. Yet there is another misconception about ancient sleep that is even more surprising. We often imagine entire tribes sleeping peacefully from sunset until sunrise, but growing evidence suggests that this picture may be completely wrong. In fact, our ancestors may never have slept through the entire night in the way most modern people try to today, and understanding why reveals another forgotten survival strategy that completely changes how we think about human sleep. One of the biggest assumptions we make about sleep is that humans have always slept the way we do today. We imagine our ancestors lying down after sunset, sleeping peacefully for 8 uninterrupted hours, and waking up with the morning light. It feels so natural that most people never question it. But when anthropologists began studying some of the world's remaining hunter-gatherer societies, they found something that challenged this entire picture. Sleep among ancient-style communities was often far more flexible than our modern routines. People didn't always go to bed at exactly the same time. They didn't always wake up together, and perhaps most surprisingly, there was rarely a moment during the entire night when everyone in the group was asleep at once. Someone was almost always awake. Sometimes it was an older member of the group adding wood to the fire. Sometimes it was a parent checking on a child. Sometimes it was a hunter whose body naturally woke during the night. And sometimes there was no obvious reason at all. Yet this seemingly random pattern created an extraordinary survival advantage. While one person rested, another remained alert, meaning the camp was almost never completely defenseless. Modern researchers studying hunter-gatherer groups, such as the Hadza in Tanzania, noticed exactly this phenomenon. Across dozens of nights, they found that there were only a few brief moments when every adult happened to be asleep simultaneously. For most of the night, someone was awake, intentionally or not, creating what scientists sometimes describe as a natural form of night watch without anyone assigning shifts or standing guard. No alarms, no schedules, no military discipline. Just the result of thousands of generations of human biology interacting with social life. This discovery completely changes the way we think about ancient sleep. What appears disorganized at first glance may actually be an elegant evolutionary solution. Instead of forcing every individual to stay awake all night, evolution spread wakefulness naturally across the group, ensuring that danger was more likely to be detected before it reached the camp. Even today, traces of this ancient behavior may still exist within us. Many people wake briefly during the night, check the time, roll over, and fall back asleep within minutes. We usually think something is wrong with our sleep when this happens. But historians and sleep researchers have suggested that waking during the night was once so common that people in medieval Europe even had separate names for their first sleep and second sleep, with a quiet period of wakefulness in between. In other words, uninterrupted 8-hour sleep may not be the ancient human default we assume it to be. It may instead be another expectation shaped by modern work schedules, electric lighting, and industrial life. But if ancient humans weren't relying on clocks, weren't sleeping in perfectly fixed schedules, and often woke naturally throughout the night, then another mystery appears. Hunters still had to leave at exactly the right moment. Entire groups still had to move together. Survival still depended on precise timing. So what gave them such remarkable consistency day after day? The answer wasn't hidden in the stars or in the sunrise alone. It was hidden in one of the most powerful forces that shaped every decision our ancestors ever made: the constant pressure to survive. Perhaps the biggest mistake we make when imagining ancient life is assuming that our ancestors woke up because they wanted to. In reality, they woke up because they had to. Every sunrise marked the beginning of another race against time. Food had to be found before the heat of the day became unbearable. Hunters needed to leave while animal tracks were still fresh and before prey disappeared into thick vegetation. Gatherers searched for fruits, roots, and edible plants before competing groups or wild animals reached them first. Even collecting water became more dangerous as the day grew hotter and predators gathered around rivers and watering holes. In a world where missing just a few productive hours could mean going hungry, sleeping late wasn't an inconvenience. It was a survival risk. Over thousands of generations, natural selection quietly favored individuals whose internal clocks matched the rhythm of their environment. Those who consistently woke too late had fewer opportunities to hunt, gather food, protect their families, and ultimately pass on their genes. Evolution doesn't reward laziness or punish it with moral judgment. It simply rewards whatever increases the chances of survival. Little by little, generation after generation, humans became remarkably good at waking close to the time when their environment demanded action. This wasn't discipline in the modern sense. It was biology shaped by survival. Even our hormones reflect this ancient pattern. Just before dawn, the body naturally begins increasing cortisol, often called the awakening hormone. Today, the word cortisol is usually associated with stress, but in healthy amounts it performs an essential function. It prepares the brain to become alert, raises blood sugar to provide energy, and gradually shifts the body from rest to action. Long before humans understood hormones or even knew what a brain was, their bodies were already performing this complex chemical routine every single morning. And because this process repeated every day for countless generations, waking early gradually became one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. But survival wasn't only about finding food. It was also about avoiding unnecessary danger. During the hottest hours of the afternoon, many animals became less active, and humans often slowed their own activities to conserve energy before becoming active again later in the day. Their lives followed the rhythms of nature instead of forcing nature to follow their schedules. Compare that with modern life, where alarms drag people out of bed after only a few hours of sleep. Artificial lighting convinces the brain that midnight is still daytime, and work schedules often ignore the body's natural biological signals altogether. The contrast is striking. Ancient humans adapted themselves to the environment, while modern humans spend enormous effort trying to make the environment adapt to them. Perhaps this is why sleep disorders, chronic fatigue, and dependence on alarm clocks have become so common in the modern world. We often blame ourselves for feeling tired, when in reality we may be asking our bodies to ignore millions of years of evolutionary programming. But if nature and survival shaped such an incredibly reliable biological system, then something extraordinary must have happened later in human history to weaken it. The turning point wasn't the invention of the alarm clock itself. It began thousands of years earlier, when humans made one decision that transformed nearly every aspect of life forever. They stopped wandering and started farming. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived according to the same schedule that governed nearly every other animal on Earth. They moved with daylight, rested with darkness, and allowed the changing seasons to shape the rhythm of their lives. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something happened that would slowly begin rewriting that relationship forever. Instead of following food across the landscape, humans began growing it in one place. The agricultural revolution is often celebrated as the beginning of civilization, and in many ways it truly was. Permanent villages appeared, food production became more predictable, populations grew larger, and eventually towns, kingdoms, and cities emerged. But every great invention comes with trade-offs, and farming quietly introduced a new concept that our hunter-gatherer ancestors had rarely experienced before: fixed schedules. Crops could not be harvested whenever people happened to wake up. Fields demanded attention at specific times. Animals had to be fed every morning. Irrigation systems needed constant maintenance. Entire communities now depended on coordinated routines rather than individual biological rhythms. For perhaps the first time in human history, the clock outside the body slowly began becoming more important than the clock inside it. This change wasn't immediate. It unfolded over thousands of years, almost too slowly for any single generation to notice. Yet with every century, human life became slightly more structured, slightly more predictable, and slightly less connected to nature's original timing signals. As civilizations expanded, another transformation quietly followed. Markets opened at certain hours. Religious ceremonies took place at fixed times. Armies marched according to commands instead of sunrise alone. Eventually, the invention of mechanical clocks during the Middle Ages changed something even more profound. Time was no longer something people observed. It became something they measured. Minutes and hours, once almost meaningless to ordinary people, suddenly dictated work, trade, travel, and daily life. Humanity had created a machine capable of keeping time more precisely than ever before, but in doing so, people gradually stopped listening to the biological clock that had guided their species for millions of years. Historians often describe clocks as one of civilization's greatest inventions, yet they rarely mention the subtle psychological shift that accompanied them. Instead of asking, "Is my body ready?" people increasingly asked, "What time is it?" That single change altered the relationship between humans and sleep more than almost anything that had come before it. Yet even after farming, cities, and mechanical clocks, most people still lived under one powerful natural rule. When the sun disappeared, darkness eventually forced them to sleep. The true break between human biology and human behavior had not happened yet. It was still waiting in the future, hidden inside one invention so ordinary today that we barely notice it, even though it has transformed every single night of our lives. And compared to everything that came before, its impact would be far greater than farming, cities, or even the invention of time itself. One of the greatest challenges in studying ancient humans is that we cannot simply travel back in time and observe how they lived. There are no videos from 15,000 years ago, no written records describing their bedtime routines, and no eyewitness accounts explaining how they woke up each morning. So how do scientists investigate a question like this? The answer is surprisingly clever. Instead of looking into the distant past, researchers began studying modern communities whose lifestyles still resemble those of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Among the most well-known are the Hadza people of Tanzania, the San people of southern Africa, and several indigenous groups living deep within the Amazon rainforest. While none of these communities are exact replicas of prehistoric humans, they provide something incredibly valuable, a glimpse into what life looks like without electricity, without alarm clocks, and without the constant glow of modern technology. What researchers discovered challenged many popular assumptions. These communities do not simply collapse into sleep the moment the sun disappears, nor do they spend 12 hours sleeping every night, as many people imagine. Instead, their sleep patterns closely follow changes in natural light, temperature, and daily activity. Most adults sleep for roughly the same number of hours as people in industrialized societies, but the quality and timing of that sleep are often very different. They spend far more time outdoors during daylight, exposing their eyes to bright natural sunlight from morning until evening. This constant exposure strengthens the body's internal clock, making it easier to feel awake during the day and naturally sleepy after sunset. In contrast, the average modern person may spend most of the day inside offices, classrooms, shopping centers, or homes illuminated by artificial lighting that is far weaker than sunlight during the day, yet paradoxically much brighter than natural darkness at night. From the perspective of the brain, this creates a confusing world where daytime never feels bright enough and nighttime never feels dark enough. Researchers have also noticed another fascinating detail. People living in these traditional communities rarely experience the kind of chronic insomnia that has become increasingly common in modern societies. They certainly wake during the night from time to time, just as their ancestors likely did, but they generally fall asleep again with little difficulty because their biological clocks remain closely synchronized with the environment around them. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery, however, is that these communities continue functioning remarkably well without relying on alarm clocks to begin each day. Their routines are guided by nature, by social responsibilities, and by biological rhythms that have remained largely unchanged for thousands of generations. This doesn't mean ancient life was easier. In many ways, it was unimaginably harder. But it does suggest that the human body evolved in close partnership with the natural world, a partnership that modern civilization has gradually weakened. The more scientists compare traditional societies with industrialized ones, the clearer one pattern becomes. The issue is not that modern humans have lost their biological clock. We all still possess it. The real difference is that we now surround it with countless signals that constantly tell it the wrong time. Yet if that invisible clock still exists inside every one of us, then why did humanity become so dependent on alarm clocks in the first place? The answer has surprisingly little to do with biology, and almost everything to do with the way modern society chose to organize time itself. The invention of the alarm clock is often presented as another step in human progress, a clever tool that helped people become more productive and organized. But in reality, the alarm clock wasn't invented because the human body suddenly forgot how to wake itself. It was invented because society began demanding that millions of people wake up at the exact same time, regardless of what their own biology was trying to tell them. For most of human history, there was no such thing as a universal morning. A hunter woke when conditions were right for hunting. A farmer adjusted to the seasons. A fisherman depended on the tides. Daily life followed nature rather than a factory schedule. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it came something entirely new. Factories could not wait for each worker's biological rhythm. Machines started at a fixed hour, trains departed according to precise timetables, schools opened at the same time every morning, and entire cities began organizing life around the clock instead of the sun. For the first time in human history, being late by just a few minutes could cost someone their wages, their education, or even their job. The alarm clock was no longer a convenience. It became a necessity. Yet our biology never signed that agreement. Deep inside the brain, the same ancient clock that guided hunter-gatherers across African savannas continued following the cycle of light and darkness, while the modern world demanded that people ignore those signals in favor of numbers printed on a clock face. This created a conflict that billions of people still experience every single morning. If you've ever woken to the sound of an alarm and immediately wanted to go back to sleep, it doesn't automatically mean you're lazy or undisciplined. In many cases, it simply means your biological clock and your social clock are no longer synchronized. Sleep scientists even have a term for this mismatch: social jet lag. It describes the exhausting feeling of living in one time zone biologically while being forced to operate in another socially. Unlike ordinary jet lag, which happens after crossing continents, social jet lag can happen without ever leaving your hometown. Millions of people experience it every weekday, only to sleep differently on weekends when their bodies are finally allowed to follow a more natural rhythm. This may explain why so many people wake up before their alarm on vacation, while struggling to get out of bed during the work week. The body hasn't forgotten how to keep time. It simply performs better when it is allowed to work with nature instead of constantly fighting against it. Ironically, the more advanced our civilization became, the more dependent we became on devices that compensate for a problem civilization itself created. The alarm clock is not proof that humans evolved beyond nature. In many ways, it is evidence that modern life has drifted away from it. And that brings us to one final question. If our ancestors never needed alarms, and if the ancient biological clock still exists inside every one of us today, what does that reveal about the relationship between human evolution and the modern world? The answer is perhaps the most fascinating lesson of this entire story.